Hello everyone, my name is Val Thomas and I feel very honoured to have been invited to present this keynote speech at the conference. So a little bit about my background. I'm a UK-based psychotherapist and I have worked in many different contexts and in private practice. I am an integrative psychotherapist. I also worked as a counselling trainer and I headed psychotherapy training programs in UK universities. And my specialism has been using mental imagery in therapy and in creative processes. I've researched this topic and published papers and 2 books with Routledge on this subject. So my interest in counselling and psychotherapy has shifted over the last few years to a very different arena. This is a political arena. And I've become increasingly concerned with the politicization of the therapy field. So the focus of my speech today, or my talk today, is going to be about critical social justice. Oops. So here we are. So the title is Critical Social Justice, an Existential Threat to Therapy. So I want to tell you a little bit about why this has become a central focus for me and why I want to talk to you about this matter. So a few years ago, around about 2016, I started to notice some concepts coming into the field that were not being debated and they were being accepted as uncontested. And these were ideas coming out of gender ideology. So we're starting to see terms like cisgender and non-binary. Any attempt to discuss this was very much frowned upon. Over the next 2 or 3 years, we started seeing ideas such as white privilege, ideas about white supremacy, systems of power and oppression were being imported into the discourse around therapy. And this came to a head in 2020 after the death of George Floyd. The response of the therapy bodies and institutions in America and in the UK was uniform. They all of them issued statements that were highly political, and these statements decrying the tragedy of George Floyd's death, and also insisting that therapy would now be harnessed to political aims of undoing and dismantling systematic racism within society and within their institutions. And I started to look around to see if there were any other writing that was more nuanced, any writing that was critiquing these positions. And I could only find a couple of essays that were published on a site by James Lindsay, who is now a public commentator and critic of the infiltration of critical social justice into culture. And I realized at that point that I would need to start to write about this, research it and write about it. And so I wrote a trilogy of essays, which making the argument that critical social justice theories pose an existential threat to therapy. And on the back of the reception of those essays, I realized that we needed to kind of create a platform for dissidents in the therapy field to come together and develop some kind of critique about the direction that therapy was being moved in. So we set up an organization called Critical Therapy Antidote. We created a platform for critical essays, and we also set up a network for dissident therapists. By the end of 2020, we realized that nothing was being published in the field. Nothing was being allowed to be published in the field would be a better way of putting it. And so I commissioned 19 clinicians and theorists in our network to come together to write chapters for a collection of essays on the nature of critical social justice and the threat that it presented to the field. And we titled the book Cynical Therapies. Now it took 2 years to get this book published. We couldn't find in the end we couldn't find a publisher. So we decided to publish independently. And it was published this year in March, and it's been attracting a lot of attention, and it has been selling very well. And this is like evidence that critiques are very much needed in our field. So here is the cover of the book, Cynical Therapies, the anti-therapeutic nature of critical social justice. We chose that subtitle because although the different authors in the book had different perspectives, obviously, and there were disagreements between us, the one thing we were all in agreement with was that critical social justice is, by its very nature, anti-therapeutic and actually anti-relational. So in this talk, I've got 6 aims. I really want to talk about the worldview of critical social justice. It's important to do this because critical social justice, which I'll refer to by the acronym CSJ, has been sold to us as a natural evolution of earlier ideas of social justice, where in fact it's nothing of the kind. It's a completely different worldview. I want to explain how it's got into therapy, as far as I can tell. I want to look at the current state of the UK therapy field, because that's the area where I have most knowledge. I want to spell out the anti-therapeutic nature of critical social justice. Why exactly does this present such a threat? I want to offer my predictions about how this trend is likely to unfold, and I want to say something about what we can do about it. So let's start with a definition. Now, CSJ, in ordinary common parlance, is known as woke. Now, this is an umbrella term, and under this umbrella, there's a group of theories. Some of these you'll have heard of. Includes critical race theory, post-colonialism, gender theory. You might have heard of others, such as fat studies, disability studies. And all of these are informed by kind of critical theory. Now, critical social justice is basically a combination of postmodernism and critical theory. Now, if we think about postmodernism, we'll see that it is characterized by a series of things. The first is a distrust of grand narratives. So anything that presents itself as an explanation, a grand explanation, is viewed with suspicion. In terms of psychological therapies, an obvious example would be psychoanalytical theory. This is an explanation, a grand explanation according to postmodernism, and it will be viewed with great suspicion. There's a big focus on the power of language, and this is related to the notion that our experience of the world is created by the way in which our culture uses language. So in other words, language generates the social world. Now, if language generates the social world, then words are very, very powerful. And we can see that showing up in cancel culture with its claim that words have the power to harm people. It has the ideas of relativism. What this means is that there's no such thing as truth. Truth is relative and it's dependent on different cultural understandings of truth. And you can't elevate one culture above another. Everything is equal. Social constructionism we've just referred to. Again, it's this notion that everything that we experience is socially constructed. There's no such thing as universalism. Postmodernism is hostile to modernity and all of its products and philosophies. So in particular, it's hostile to empirical science, and it refutes the notion of the importance of evidence. And one of the reasons why it's very difficult to get any traction in debate with critical social justice is that its advocates refute debate as a product of modernity. Now, critical theory, the other thread that's woven into critical social justice, was developed in the 30s and 40s in Germany by the Frankfurt School. And this really arose out of a response to the failure of classic Marxism based on economic class analysis to produce the desired revolution. So it shifted its focus from economic class to this notion of cultural groups as a cultural analysis. So it positioned groups such as ethnic groups or cultural groups or groups such as women, for example, as marginalized without power, and that those were the oppressed classes. And it's very, very strategic. Critical theory is particularly strategic, and it developed this idea based on the work of the Italian Marxist Gramsci, who created the idea of the long march through the institutions. So he strongly argued that people needed to move into the institutions being the church, education, the media, and work within the institutions in order to change them from within and build up a push for revolution through internal change. We can see that has been happening in America, North America, through their education system. So teachers were being educated in the education colleges with the ideas of Paulo Freire, the critical theorist, and his ideas were that you needed to inculcate ideas of understanding the nature of oppression, society's oppression. You need to inculcate these ideas into students, and then students would become activists and work for a revolutionary ends. So, tied together, critical social justice has become applied postmodernism. So very abstruse ideas in academia have been merged with highly strategic Marxist critical theory. And the aims of critical social justice are to disrupt and dismantle the hegemony and thereby creating the grounds for a revolution which will produce a utopia. So that definition would suggest that critical social justice is an unlikely candidate to become involved in any way with a therapeutic project. So the big question is, how did it get into the therapy field in America and more latterly the UK? And it did this really because therapy reflects mainstream culture. So in the wider world, critical social justice was developing mainly within academia. And it started in as a form of literary criticism. And in the 1990s, it moved more generally into the humanities and into social sciences. And after the turn of the millennium, it started to move into other areas of the curriculum and faculties within academia. And these ideas began to be exported into the external world, people coming out of being trained in the universities, gaining positions of power in bureaucracies, and then being able to establish an authoritarian council culture. So any attempt to oppose this will lead you to being attacked and characterized as a bigot and reactionary. So let's actually look at the therapy field specifically, and let's go back to the turn of the millennium. And what was the therapy field like? Well, it was characterized by pluralism, lots and lots of different approaches to therapy, all jostling up against each other, very wide range. So on one hand, you have empirically based cognitive behavioral therapy, and on the other end of the continuum, you have philosophically based therapeutic approaches such as existential psychotherapy, and loads of different approaches in between. Society was becoming increasingly multicultural, and the therapy field was adapting to this. So you start to see more emphasis on clinicians being taught multicultural counselling skills. Cultural competence was being emphasised. The therapy field was also integrating postmodern ideas. So this notion of the socially constructed self was looked on with some favour. And we had a couple of approaches that were informed by this. For example, narrative therapy was developed in the late 80s and 1990s. And this is the idea that the narratives that people tell about their identity determines how they are in the world. You know, that power of language, this idea that the self is being generated out of the cultural context, and the therapist would work with the client to reshape the narratives in order to encourage better functioning. You can start to see more emphasis on societal context. More attention was being paid on the way in which this informed and influenced how people were operating, the difficulties that they were bringing to therapy. And there was an increasing trend on the problematization of therapy as a Western science. So therapy had been critiqued for decades, but towards the millennium, there was more interest in the way in which therapy was a product of a particular culture. It was a Western science, and therefore had those limitations and those particular perspectives of the world baked into the therapeutic approach. Between 2000, so we could see that this was a point when the therapy field was expanding. It was expanding, and it was at the point of integrating more expanded understanding of the self, more dimensions of the self being integrated into the therapeutic project. Now, between 2000 and 2020, behind the scenes, activist therapists were gaining power in the professional institutions, just like mainstream culture. And as they gained power in the institutions, they were foregrounding identity. Identity is everything. And the professional bodies were starting to promulgate notions of traditional therapy being problematic. It's white supremacy in action. And as the activist therapists gained more power, then they were able to counsel debate across the field or any critique. So you don't see any papers being published critiquing this. And the accusations of bigotry and racism were very successful in silencing clinicians. I mean, obviously, what clinician could withstand those kind of accusations would be professional suicide. And they're also moving into the realm of changing the professional criteria as well within the professional bodies to force compliance. So where we now, well, if you look at the USA, you can see that the field itself has pivoted to the collective. So instead of expanding out to embrace and integrate the collective, it now focuses on the collective, and it's the social, cultural context of the client, which is the most important. It trumps the individual and universal dimensions of the client. So no public or critique, and state licensing is being used to force compliance. Like, for example, a couple of states recently have announced that in order to maintain your state registration, you need to attend unconscious bias training. Okay, so it's got into therapy. Right, now how is it being maintained in therapy? Well, there's a top-down imposition of critical social justice. I mean, there's a bottom-up with the activists coming in, but there's also this top-down imposition. So let's listen to the president of the American Psychological Society, Thelma Bryant. She just recently in post, and listen to a minute and a half from a speech where she advocates for a decolonized therapy. And when you listen to this, I want you to note the framing. Individual therapy is bad and needs to be replaced with therapy that attends to the societal context. And note some of the concepts she uses, such as white supremacy. And we'll come back to the final statement when we've watched this.
My name is Tama Simone Bryant, and I am a descendant of the Mende people who survived the transatlantic slave trade. I want to acknowledge my ancestors whose exploited labor is the basis of this nation's accelerated growth, and whose genius and creativity have left an imprint in every industry and every field. I also want us to acknowledge the indigenous people who cultivated this land that we call Nashville. People like the Cherokee, the Seneca, the Shawnee, those who were forcibly removed but who continue to live today, cultivating land and legacy beyond our years. So here at the intersection of land and labor, spoken and unspoken truths, we gather. My first name, Tama, means queen. My parents, having lived through anti-Black racism, lovingly armed me with this name, recognizing that even people who underestimate me have to honor me when they say my name. My middle name, Simone, is after the legendary singer, songwriter, activist, and truth teller Nina Simone. And my last name, Bryant, connects me with a legacy of preachers, orators, storytellers, and griots who understand the power of the word. Understanding the power of words, I'm a psychologist who is here to talk to you today about decolonizing psychology. To colonize is to capture, to take, to control, to disconnect, to disenfranchise, to de-identify. To decolonize is to reclaim, to reconnect, to honor, to recognize our interconnectedness with all living things. It is to identify with truth and live from a place of truth. A colonized psychology sees you fundamentally as a series of cognitions for us to diagnose, pathologize, control, transform, change, detect, research. A decolonized psychology recognizes that your social, political, economic environment and systems affects your mental health. So why is decolonizing psychology so important here in the States? The American Psychological Association has documented that people of color are underrepresented in the field. In fact, they have found that 4% of psychologists are Black, 4 to 5% are Asian, 5 to 10% are Latino, and 0.3% are Native American. 1% indicate that they are mixed race or other. Even though we are underrepresented in the field of psychology, we are at increased risk for stress and trauma. In fact, the FBI found last year that hate crimes were at their highest for the past 12 years. And in major cities, hate crimes were up 39 to 44% last year. And so with the realities of racial stress and trauma, as well as other sources of stress and trauma, we need a contextualized psychology. When we take a global perspective, I'm reminded of a story that is told in Rwanda. In the aftermath of national trauma and terror, the people were brokenhearted and need healing. In elder reports, that Westerners came who were mental health professionals and claimed they were going to help us heal. The elder reports, they said they were going to help us feel better. They came with no songs. They came without dancers. They didn't bring any storytellers. They separated us from each other. They took us out of the sun and put us into dark rooms and told us to tell them our most painful memories. It was not healing. We had to ask them to leave. Indigenous healers around the globe often assess psychology and often assess distress with a variation of these questions. When did you lose connection with your Creator? When did you stop honoring your ancestors? When did you stop singing? When did you stop dancing? When did you stop finding yourself in the gift of story? If you answer those questions, I'll have a sense of the timeline and the source of your distress. So we need to decolonize psychology. We need to shift from an over-focus and over-emphasis on the individual while we are neglecting systems and start to pay attention to context. Can you imagine if a psychologist thought the only reason you have an eating disorder or body image issues is because of your cognitive distortions and the dieting practices of your mother? As if we are not all bombarded with messages from the time that we can perceive that tell us how we are supposed to look and that present these narrow ideas of beauty that are based on Eurocentric, ageist, ableist ideas that often leave your beauty and mine in the margins. A decolonized psychology says that we have to honor identity, culture, heritage, history, politics, because all of those things affect our lives and our mental health. So to decolonize psychology is also to recognize that justice is therapeutic. Justice is healing. Not just taking deep breaths, not just journaling, but if we can shift some social systems, it would help a lot of us feel a lot better. So as we are looking to decolonize, we want to decolonize the intake process. We want to decolonize our interventions to be more holistic, and we want to decolonize our outcomes so that we are not just helping people to cope, but actually empowering people to be agents of change. So to decolonize the intake process, I want to invite you to come into my office. There's a blue couch here, a blue chair there, a palm tree over there, some instruments in the corner. You get the picture. And so I want you to sit in on this intake process with a fictionalized African-American family, which we'll call the Murphys. Mr. Murphy works in corporate America and is very successful at his job. And at the end of the day, he comes home, watches TV with the door closed until late into the night. Mrs. Murphy also works during the day, comes home during the evening, is in the kitchen preparing dinner, and then in the living room by herself watching TV late until the night. The eldest child is a daughter who we'll call Charisma. Charisma is very studious, and she's in her room studying on her computer late until the night, getting all A's semester after semester. And then we have the little brother who we'll call Solomon, who claims he doesn't have any homework. So he's on his computer playing video games late into the night. So as a psychologist, I come in and we have to get the right questions so that I can formulate and have a case conceptualization, because my conceptualization of the case is going to lead to the treatment plan, and the treatment plan is going to lead to the outcomes. So the questions that I ask to frame your life help me to figure out what we are creating with our time together. So I asked Mrs. Murphy and I asked the family, what is it that they've come in for? And Mrs. Murphy volunteers because she was the one who decided the family needed to come. And she said, my family is just too disconnected. Everybody's doing their own thing, and I want us to be together more as a family. A colonized psychology would hear what I just shared and say, well, we need to ask the parents about their family of origin and what were the communication styles with them. And we need to talk to them about the value of communication and quality time. We can give them a handout. You all know psychologists. We have a lot of handouts. We can give you a handout on connection. We can give you a handout about avoidance and the dangers of avoidance. We can give you a handout about too much screen time for little Solomon over there. We have lots and lots of handouts. And if I was really doing my job as a psychologist, I would give you homework, because we don't want to just sit here and talk and nothing ever changes. So this family needs to have an outing. How about bowling? And when you go bowling, leave all your devices in the car, because you need to stay connected. And when you get advanced, you should start having dinner together maybe 4 to 5 times a week, because this will really be important to get the family connected. Does that sound good? It sounds pretty good, right? All of that is a colonized, cookie cutter, manualized approach to psychotherapy. And it went off the tracks because we did not ask the right questions. So if we start to go a little deeper and really begin to ask about people's experiences with discrimination, stereotype, and stigma, we'll get a different picture of this family. You'll find out that Mr. Murphy started having panic attacks when George Floyd was murdered. When George Floyd was murdered by a police officer and he was unarmed, Mr. Murphy started having nightmares where he also could not breathe. He started dreading going to work in the morning, and he would show up to corporate America being one of the few black men who worked in his agency. And even though he was very successful, he would find himself in the middle of the day, multiple times a day, having to run to the bathroom and put water on his face because he couldn't breathe. Mrs. Murphy, you would find out, is living with the realities of Superwoman syndrome, where we are often raised to erase ourselves, to neglect ourselves in service of everyone else. And while some call it Superwoman syndrome, a lot of people in the black community would say that's not a syndrome, that's ideal black womanhood. You are to surrender yourself for the saving of your family, erase and neglect yourself for the uplifting of our community. Some mental health professionals would call Mrs. Murphy too intense and too serious. They might even think to themselves that she's an angry black woman. The truth is, Mrs. Murphy is exhausted. I'm talking about soul tired, the kind of fatigue that won't be fixed by a nap or even a bowling trip. And then we have Charisma, who is very perceptive and insightful. She has picked up on the stress of her mother and the strain of her father, and realized one of the things that brings her family joy are her A's and accomplishments. And so she gets lots of them and has immersed herself in perfectionism to not only relieve their pain and distress, but also to gain for herself some visibility. Going to a predominantly white school in a predominantly white neighborhood, her black beauty is often overlooked, denied, and ridiculed. She sees a lot of black girl magic in social media, but she's had trouble getting hold of that magic for herself. Last school year, she would spend hours in front of the mirror trying to make herself look like the queens on TV, but she would still walk through the halls, somehow invisible. After doing that for months, she gave up on that project and decided, you don't have to acknowledge I'm beautiful, but you will have to admit I'm smart. And that satisfied her on some level, but her soul is still hungry. And then we have Solomon. No one has given Solomon words for what it feels like as a black boy in America to constantly feel like he is under surveillance and suspicion. He doesn't have words for what it means this summer when he was walking through the mall from store to store trying to find a job and felt like people thought that he was a threat, a thug, violent, a monster, and no one would give him a chance. He does not have the words for it. He sees his father coping by drinking, and his mother copes with prayer, and his sister copes by studying, and none of those appeal to him. And so he goes into the alternative world of video games, where he can create his own character and decide how people respond to him. He can even accumulate power the longer he plays the game, and so he plays longer, but somehow the empowerment never translates to his real life. I hope as you hear this family, you can see why a handout is insufficient on communication skills. I hope you can feel how a bowling activity is a very surface level response, But what is needed as we talk about transforming families and transforming communities is a decolonized approach that even incorporates their cultural traditions and arts. And so we start to sing a song I learned in Botswana. We are one family and none can separate us. None can separate us. None can separate us. We are one family and none can separate us. No, no, never. And then because we hold stress in our body and strain in our body, we even start to move and to dance in therapy, y'all. In therapy, we start to move and to dance. And do you know that when Mr. and Mrs. Murphy start dancing, their children fall out laughing because they've never seen their parents dance before? And in the midst of the poetry and the spoken word and the dance and the drama, I start to talk about the reason we need resistant strategies, not just coping strategies, but how do you protect your mind, your heart, your spirit when you are walking through toxic environments? And Charisma shares that she loves Beyonce's new song, that they can't break my soul. They can't break my soul. They can't break my soul. And as she tells that story, her mother starts to talk about when she was growing up, between learning how to cornrow hair and bake cornbread and cook collard greens, she also learned the importance of her walk. That her eldest aunt told her, all the women in this family are brilliant and foxes, so if you in this family, you got to know how to walk. And when you know how to walk, you are not invisible. And Mr. Murphy starts laughing because it was the walk that got his attention to begin with. And so in the midst of their sharing, Solomon breaks down and finally tells his family what happened this summer when he was trying to get a job and how he was treated and how he was followed around stores. And he starts to cry, and his sister hugs him, and his mother, because she is a superwoman, starts naming all of her friends who could give him a job so he doesn't need to work at that raggedy mall anyway, because anybody who doesn't see the value of her son is garbage to begin with. And so they are intervening, and I look over to my right, and Mr. Murphy on the top is cool as a cucumber, but that right leg is shaking. And he's cool, and he's watching, and his son is crying. His sister is rubbing the son's back. His wife is strategizing, and the leg is shaking. And I said, can we all just take a breath in, reaching up to the sky? And can we all just shake everything out? And when we shake it all out, the leg stops shaking, and I say, Mr. Murphy, is there something you want to say to Solomon? And somewhere between a howl and a declaration and a whisper, he looks at his son and says, Solomon, you're a king. You're a king. And his son walks over and gives him a hug, and he whispers in his ear, you are a blessing everywhere you go. And as he talks to his son, he's talking to himself. As he talks to his son, he's talking to himself. And this is why it is not okay for psychologists to treat each of us like we are identical, because we are all living culturalized, politicized, real lives. And while we know transformation takes place in protest march and in the Supreme Court, that transformation happens based on who you put in the jury box and on the school board, I want you to know transformation also takes place in the therapy room. So in the words of Tracy Chapman, don't you know we're talking about a revolution? Sounds like a whisper.
That final statement, I think, is key, where Thelma Bryant states very strongly, justice is therapeutic. She repeats it, justice is therapeutic. Now, it's a very, very simple move to make. To justice should be the focus of therapy. And this is what critical social justice does. It moves justice to the forefront of the therapeutic endeavor. And justice now becomes the most important point of therapy, and therapy becomes a political activity. Okay, so let's look at the current situation in the UK. So we looked at the States mainly. What's happening in the UK? Well, it's following North America. Critical social justice doesn't have such a purchase on the UK that it does in North America, but it's growing very, very rapidly. So all of our therapy bureaucracies, and by that I mean our professional bodies and our regulatory administrations, are captured to a greater or lesser extent by this ideology. I'll show you some evidence in a moment. We've got an issue with where our therapy programs are being delivered. Our training institutions are mainly the universities, and all of the universities are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's imposed upon the training programs. And the training institutions themselves are becoming increasingly authoritarian. So what's the evidence for this? Well, let's go and have a look at the main professional body in the UK, which is the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. Let's go to its homepage. And on its homepage, it has its statement of philosophy, as you would expect. The very first paragraph begins with this statement: our desire for social justice determines everything we do. This comes before any statement about therapy and the purpose of the organisation in relation to helping professions. So there is a strong suggestion here that social justice is the most important consideration for this organisation. Let's have a look at another bureaucracy. This is the Healthcare Professions Council. Now, this is the UK regulatory body for counselling psychologists. Now, it's a regulatory body for a wide range of healthcare professions. Counselling psychologists are one of those professions. And they've just brought out a new revised set of criteria. There's one criterion that is specific to counselling psychology. Look at the difference between the old and the new. So the current standard is understand social and cultural contexts and the nature of relationships throughout the lifespan. That sounds as if it would map very well onto traditional therapy approaches. It has both understanding societal dimension of the client, but it's also got the psychological and intrapsychic dimension of the client, the nature of relationships through the lifespan. Look what this becomes. Counselling psychologists should understand social and cultural contexts in a manner informed by community critical and social constructivist perspectives. Note two things about this. First thing is it's removed the psychological dimension. There's no reference to lifespan or the nature of relationships. Those have been removed. And there's a sense of psychology being erased, individual psychology being erased, the individual dimensions of the client. And how does it view social and cultural context? Well, this has shifted from a general understanding, and there might be multiple perspectives and viewpoints, to just one. And this is a critical social justice view. Note critical and note the social constructivist phrasing in there. This begs a question, doesn't it? Does this mean that a counselling psychologist holds different views of social and cultural contexts, or traditional views of social and cultural contexts? Does this mean they're going to be penalised? Does this mean they are not complying with the criterion? Very big question. Let's look at some more evidence. So last year, Doctors Sherwood and Miller, who respectively clinical psychologist and a social psychologist, decided to carry out an independent inquiry into the condition of clinical psychology training at doctoral level, just because of the alarms that were being raised by current students. And they used a particular methodology of sending out freedom of information requests to all of the clinical training programs. There were 31 of them. They had a significant number of responses. It was about 26. And the findings from this inquiry suggest that most of the programs are captured to a greater or lesser degree. The programs are promoting critical social justice ideas, including that decolonized curriculum that we were just listening to in the previous YouTube clip. Students are being encouraged to view themselves as activists, political activists. And the most important thing, or thing that's being foregrounded for these students, is this client's identity and their oppressor or oppressed status, which is the most important factor in any diagnosis and consequent treatment. A couple of examples, verbatim examples from the FOI submission. So the University of Exeter says that trainees are expected to address inequality and power in their assignments, with marks awarded for addressing contextual factors such as patient context and culture and diversity. So you can see this emphasis on power and this uncontested acceptance of these notions of inequality and power being generally applicable. Look at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College. This is a very interesting one. We are piloting amendments to rating criteria in trainee recruitment that would privilege EDI. EDI is equity, diversity and inclusion, and or anti-racism awareness and experience. You can see by this that what the recruiting panel are looking for is they're looking for students who are already signed up to critical social justice. Okay, so we've looked at what extent it's encroached into the field, but we haven't really talked about why it's actually a problem. I mean, the therapy field, as we've already noted, is pluralistic. It's always been pluralistic. At the turn of the millennium, there were hundreds of different approaches to therapy. And that raises the question, surely it can accommodate sort of radical new approaches. A radical new approach such as critical social justice, for example. So why are we making the claim that this is presenting an existential threat? Well, the reason that it is because it's different. And its difference is predicated on three factors. Firstly, it's a completely different worldview. It's not a development or an evolution of earlier ideas. And this is the way in which it's been sold to us. Critical social justice is a development of earlier ideas about social justice. So it's more inclusive, more radical, more developed. But it's not an evolution. It's a different worldview. It's a worldview that's informed, as we've already discussed, by postmodernism, not modernity, and critical theory, which is a political philosophy. And its nature is authoritarian and totalizing. So what does this mean in terms of the pluralism of therapy? It does not tolerate any other viewpoint. So although it claims to work for diversity, that does not mean a diversity of opinion, a diversity of viewpoint. And when it encounters any other viewpoint, it works to destabilize and dismantle it. And alongside that, it has a totalizing worldview. So its intention is to impose one and only one worldview, its worldview. So it works against pluralism. Once it comes into a pluralistic field, it will start to attack the pluralism itself until it has imposed itself across the whole field. So it threatens the one of the characteristics of therapy or the therapeutic field, certainly in North America and the UK. Another very significant factor is that it has a political agenda. And its political agenda is imposed upon therapy. Therapy becomes a vehicle for indoctrination. So an example of that is you can see some of the papers that have been published recently make the case that the therapist can work to change or to divert the client from the issue at hand to viewing other factors that the therapist feels are automatically implicated in their presenting issue. So a notorious paper written by Dustrup in 2015 proposes that white therapists working with white clients should be automatically bringing the client's attention to matters of race, no matter what issue the client is bringing to therapy. And papers like this are being published without any critical debate. There's this idea through all of the critical social justice driven therapy initiatives that the therapist should view themselves as an activist first. And the most important thing is to go out into the field and work with clients to inculcate these ideas of society being the cause of their problems, and for the clients to become recruited to political activism. And finally, it's anti-therapeutic. So it weakens, put it simply, it weakens the individual client across 4 dimensions. So this therapeutic approach reduces the client's agency because society is always the cause of the problems that they're bringing. And secondly, it reduces the capacity for insight because it delivers a very simple analysis to a simple formula to the client instead of encouraging exploration and helping the client consider multiple factors that might be involved in the cause of the issue that they're bringing. It reduces it to only one possible explanation, the explanation being their membership of an oppressed or oppressor group. Reduces the capacity to relate. So only power relations operate between identity groups. So it's impossible to have real relationships crossing ethnic, cultural, gender divides. So instead of increasing people's ability to work in relationships, develop relationships, it reduces their capacity. And finally, it reduces the ability to make realistic appraisals of the world. Like, for example, it's not an approach that supports realism. So, for example, it doesn't accept a sort of biological basis of sex. So it encourages clients to have kind of illusions or ungrounded understandings of the world. So, given this is an anti-therapeutic ideology and is rapidly capturing the therapy field, what can we say about the future? Where is the therapy field heading? The future is always difficult to predict, but as far as I can see, it's likely to fracture as critical social justice becomes more dominant. Then traditional therapy is likely to be pushed to the edges. It's already happening. And because critical social justice is becoming established in the therapy training programs, and therapists are being trained to be advocates and activists, they're no longer being trained in traditional therapy, we're going to see a previous generation of traditional therapists retire and new therapist activists take their place. So this is very similar to, this rings alarm bells because it's exactly what's happened in education. It's a long march through the institutions, but in terms of therapy field, it's like a speeded up version. So the demographics are not on our side. Now, I've been talking mainly about America and the UK. So this is happening in the Anglophone countries. What would happen outside these countries? For example, Southeast Asia, in particular, Philippines. I think it's already coming in. These ideas are already coming in, particularly through gender ideology. But I suspect this worldview in psychological therapies one of the main doorways will come in through criticizing the Eurocentric nature of psychology. And of course, these ideas are attractive to kind of young students, and then they'll be radicalized in this way. What can we do about it? Well, I think the most important thing, as far as I can see, is that we have to really, really be clear that we are losing the healing ethos of psychological therapy. Once it's got a political aim, it's no longer a healing practice. So we really need to hold on to this. So we need to speak out. We have to be courageous. We have to withstand attempts to characterize us as reactionary and bigots and racists. It's very important that the general public, who are going to be the consumers of potential consumers of therapy, are made aware that the contents of the tin label therapy is changing. These contents are not what they think they are any longer. And that was the intention of our book. It was written for for the general public, and we wanted to help people understand that something was going wrong with therapy and that they need to be very aware when they came to choose a therapist. And it's important to build up this groundswell of informed opinion. One of the ways we can do this is insist on a proper labeling of this approach. Now, as a consumer of therapy, we would expect to know what we're purchasing. So if somebody had, for example, a particular religious perspective that influenced their therapy, such as so they were Christian, and they use Christian concepts and beliefs and ideas in their practice, we would expect to be informed of that. So we would expect to be told that this is a Christian counselor. We would be we would not be happy to find that we had a counsellor or therapist who was pushing a particular worldview upon us or a particular religious belief that they had not been explicit about. And we need to insist that critical social justice driven therapy is labelled as such. And we'll have quite a big battle on our hands in order to make this explicit. One of the other things that we need to do in terms of theoretical development and conceptual development is that one of the problems with therapy has been, I think, that its understanding of the societal context of the client with regard to their presenting issues has been undeveloped. And this is the doorway or the opening that critical social justice exploited. And we really have to develop theoretical frameworks that properly integrate the intrapsychic with the societal context. We can't go backwards. We have to move forwards. We have to expand traditional therapy. We've got to develop it in this way. And the other thing we can do is we can build parallel structures. This is starting to happen. We've got a professional body that was recently set up in America called the International Association of Psychology and Counselling, that is explicitly apolitical. We've got a new institute that has opened in New York called the Open Therapy Institute, which is committed to traditional practices of open inquiry in therapy. We've got networks such as the one that I run called Critical Therapy Antidote that's expanding and developing. And of course, we've got publications such as the book that came out of Critical Therapy Antidote, Cynical Therapies. put some references here which you can look at when I share the presentation later on. And I just want to conclude with we're at a critical point. We're at a pivot point in counselling and psychotherapy and psychological therapies more generally. If we don't act now, we don't act swiftly, we're going to be in a very, very difficult situation over the next few years. And it's important that the new generations of therapists coming into the field start to investigate and inquire into these ideas and get a much clearer understanding of what's happening. Because the future is not in the hands of the previous generations of therapists now. The future of therapy is in your hands. Thank you very much for your attention.